The strange part was never that a widow wanted to stay in the house where she had been queen. The strange part was that the new queen was already in place, and the old one still seemed to think the palace answered to her. Buckingham Palace wasn't just a building in 1952. It was the question Elizabeth II had to answer before anything else. Whose monarchy was this now? Not a housing dispute, a transfer of command. The morning George VI died, a servant found him in his bed at Sandringham House in Norfolk at 7:30 in the morning. The official announcement, given at 10:45 GMT, said the king had retired in his usual health and passed away in his sleep. He was 56 years old. He had undergone surgery for lung cancer in September 1951 and never fully recovered, but the speed of it still shocked. The night before, he had dined with his family, retired at 10:30. By dawn, he was gone. Princess Elizabeth had spent the night of February 5th at Treetops Hotel in the Aberdare Mountains, the famous game-viewing lodge built in a fig tree over a waterhole. She was filming wildlife with her cine camera at dawn, asked for her tea to be brought to the platform rather than miss anything by going inside. She and Philip returned to Sagana Lodge that morning, a trout fishing retreat the people of Kenya had given them as a wedding present. It was there, beside the river, that Philip took his 25-year-old wife into the garden and told her that her father was dead and she was queen. Martin Charteris, who was present, said she was very composed, master of her fate. She immediately discussed the logistics of returning to Britain, wrote letters of apology for the tour's cancellation. The mask, as he put it, slipped once they were airborne. She left her seat, was gone a while, returned with her face set. The other passengers understood. 70 years later, in a statement marking the anniversary of her accession, Elizabeth II wrote that she still remembered February 6th as much for the death of my father, King George VI, as for the start of my reign. Both things happened at the same instant. She had no choice about which one to feel first. Back in London, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister for just 5 months, having returned to government in October 1951, was informed and convened the cabinet. He was reportedly so overcome by grief that colleagues worried whether he could function. George VI had been young, 56, and Churchill was 77. Before the cabinet had finished its meeting, the House of Commons suspended its session as a mark of respect. Outside Buckingham Palace that afternoon, crowds gathered in the bitter cold and rain. Police pressed them back from the gates. They stayed until well after dark. Buckingham Palace in February 1952 was doing precisely what Buckingham Palace was built to do. It wasn't simply the largest house in London. It had been the official London residence and administrative headquarters of the British monarch since the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. That distinction matters. The private secretaries' offices operated there. The Privy Purse and Treasurer's offices operated there. Weekly audiences with the Prime Minister were held there. Newly appointed foreign ambassadors presented their credentials there. Investitures took place in the ballroom, 600 of them in a normal year. The balcony, from which the royal family appeared at moments of national mourning or rejoicing, was the most recognized facade in British public life, and the royal standard flew above it only when the sovereign was in residence. That flag wasn't decoration, it was a signal. The monarch is here. The monarchy is open. Buckingham Palace wasn't interchangeable with any other royal address. Clarence House, a Regency building on the Mall built for the Duke of Clarence in 1825, was a royal residence. It wasn't an administrative headquarters. It wasn't the seat of investitures or prime ministerial audiences. Even decades later, when King Charles III chose to keep Clarence House as his personal London home, Buckingham Palace remained the institutional center of the monarchy. That distinction has never dissolved. You can live somewhere else. You can't move the machine. This is the detail that makes the 1952 transition more than a question of preference about rooms. Elizabeth and Philip had lived at Clarence House since 1949. They'd moved in after it was refurbished following wartime damage, and by 1952, they'd been there 3 years. Their children's home, their private domestic life, the place where they'd built something of their own after years of official apartments and naval postings. When Elizabeth returned from Kenya as queen, she returned first to Clarence House. The royal standard flew there. Her grandmother, Queen Mary, came to pay her respects there. For a brief moment, it appeared that Clarence House might simply become the new center of monarchy by default. What stopped that was institutional pressure. Biographical accounts are consistent. Elizabeth and Philip would have preferred to stay at Clarence House. It was their home. Buckingham Palace, with its 775 rooms and its World War II bomb damage and its institutional weight, wasn't what either of them wanted for personal reasons. Andrew Morton, writing for People, summarized the account this way. Elizabeth's preference for Clarence House was rejected by politicians and courtiers. The argument put to them was direct. Where the flag flies, that's where the Queen was to stay. And so, as Morton put it, they trooped over to Buckingham Palace. The role of Winston Churchill in that process is documented as influential, but not reducible to a single dramatic moment in February 1952. Biographical sources indicate a period of months, not a confrontation over a weekend. Churchill held a theory of the Crown as the permanent, continuous element of the British Constitution, standing above party politics, embodying the common inheritance of the nation. For him, Buckingham Palace wasn't a preference. It was where the flag flew, where the ambassadors came, where the sovereign received her prime minister. It was the institution made physical. He wouldn't have seen any other outcome as acceptable. What this means for the story is the piece that's rarely stated plainly enough. Elizabeth moved into Buckingham Palace against her personal preference because the institution demanded it. She absorbed that institutional logic, accepted it, and acted on it. She moved. And when she moved, she found that the person who had occupied Buckingham Palace before her was still there. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, 51 years old, the widow of a king who had been dead for weeks, had not yet gone. She had been queen consort since December 11, 1936, the day her husband became George VI after his brother Edward VIII walked away from the throne to marry Wallis Simpson. She had not chosen that particular transformation. She and George VI had both dreaded the abdication and what it meant for a man she knew was ill-suited, by temperament and by preparation, to be king. But once it happened, she was fully in. She stayed in London throughout the Blitz. She visited bombed neighborhoods in East End London. When a German bomber hit Buckingham Palace directly while she and the king were inside, she said she felt she could look the East End in the face. She appeared on the balcony in the wartime moments that mattered. She traveled to Canada and France and the United States on behalf of the Crown. She helped the king through a debilitating stammer with 15 years of daily patience. For 15 years, from December 1936 to February 1952, 15 years and 57 days, Buckingham Palace was her operational world. The household staff knew her. The routines of the place had been shaped around her preferences and her schedule. She understood the machine in the way that only long occupancy creates. Which staff answered to whom, when the staterooms were used and for what purpose, how the institution moved. A queen consort held no formal constitutional authority. Royal.uk is explicit on this, describing the consort's role as providing companionship and moral and practical support to the monarch, without a formal position in the structure of government. But practical authority isn't constitutional authority. Whoever ran the daily life of the palace, whoever the household staff deferred to in ordinary operations, whoever's preferences shaped the rhythms of that enormous machine, that was authority in a form that felt, from the inside, indistinguishable from command. Hugo Vickers, in his biography of the Queen Mother, quotes a description of her by the writer Stephen Tennant, who knew her well. She looked everything that she wasn't: gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. That portrait isn't of a woman who yielded easily. It's the portrait of someone who understood that charm was a mechanism and used it deliberately. She was 51. She had been queen consort for 15 years. She had held together a palace, a public image, and a shy king through a world war. The habits of command don't dissolve in a morning, even when the person who granted them is gone. The precise timing of her departure from Buckingham Palace is documented by different sources differently, and that ambiguity is itself the evidence. The official royal biography marks her move to Clarence House as occurring in 1952. The Vanity Fair account placed the move specifically in May 1953, describing the moment when the Queen Mother, her exquisite art collection, and her daughter Princess Margaret finally moved into Clarence House. A scholarly article on Clarence House confirms the residence was hers from 1953 to 2002. If the May 1953 date is accurate, she remained in Buckingham Palace for 15 months after Elizabeth's accession, months that included the full formal mourning period and extended well past it, up to and nearly overlapping with the coronation of June 2, 1953. 15 months in the dead king's palace while the living queen occupied her home. The popular account, that Elizabeth had to ask her mother to leave and had to ask twice before she complied, circulates widely in royal commentary and has been repeated extensively in YouTube content and social media discussions of the period. What it lacks is a named primary source. No verified passage from William Shawcross's authorized biography, no contemporaneous account from a named witness, confirms that specific framing with that specific detail. It may be accurate. It's consistent with everything else that can be confirmed, but it should be held at the certainty level the evidence supports. The pattern is documented, the exact exchange isn't. What is documented is something more revealing than a single conversation. After February 6, 1952, the Queen Mother continued to sign her correspondence as Elizabeth R., the royal R for Regina, signifying a reigning queen. Tina Brown, in The Palace Papers, published in 2022, notes that Elizabeth II, normally a stickler for protocol, said nothing when her mother persisted in this practice. The convention isn't ambiguous. Elizabeth R. was Elizabeth II's designation. A queen consort does not use it. A queen dowager does not use it. Using it after your husband's death and your daughter's accession isn't an oversight. It's a statement of position. A woman who signs herself as though she is still queen isn't a woman who has made peace with the transfer of power. The question that most treatments of this story avoid is the one that matters most. Was she staying in the palace because she was grieving and didn't want to leave? Or was she staying because she believed, at some operational level, that she still ran it? Those are different things. A grieving widow clinging to familiar rooms is sympathetic and human. A former queen consort who continues to sign her correspondence as queen, who remains in the administrative headquarters of the monarchy past the formal mourning period, who by all accounts never wanted to be in the background of anything, that is something harder to explain away with grief alone. Her own biographers consistently describe a woman of formidable will. She came into the queen consort role unwillingly, under the worst circumstances, when the abdication forced it upon her husband, and by extension, upon her. But she built something inside that role. She shaped the institution around her preferences and strengths for 15 years. And then, February 6th arrived, and the world asked her to become secondary. Here is the thing she would have known, if she was honest with herself. Buckingham Palace wasn't her property. It never had been. Buckingham Palace isn't the private property of any monarch or former monarch. It's owned by the Crown Estate, held in trust for the nation, maintained from the sovereign grant. Neither the Queen Mother nor Elizabeth II owned it in any meaningful personal sense. But ownership and command are different questions, and what the Queen Mother appears to have been reluctant to surrender wasn't a room or a view. It was the operational reality that when she moved through Buckingham Palace, things happened according to her wishes. What Elizabeth needed from Buckingham Palace was exactly that. The reality that when she moved through it, things happened according to hers. That this confrontation landed on top of grief made it not simpler, but more complicated. George VI had spoken of his family as us four: himself, his wife, and his 2 daughters. The closeness of those 4 wasn't ceremonial. Elizabeth grew up in it. Her relationship with her mother was warm and documented throughout the early reign, with the Queen Mother stepping into supportive roles as Elizabeth navigated her first years as sovereign. The person whose continued presence in Buckingham Palace threatened the new Queen's authority was also the person standing beside her at the funeral, also grieving, also diminished. An institutional conflict is one thing. An institutional conflict with the woman who is also your mother, also burying your father, is something considerably more difficult to resolve by protocol. This is why it mattered, and matters still, that Elizabeth resolved it at all. She didn't simply accept the situation. She moved into Buckingham Palace, established the new household, and at some point through the months of 1952, began the process of making clear that the administrative center of the monarchy answered to the Queen. Not to the former Queen consort, not to the institutional memory of the previous reign, to her. Philip's role in this transition is documented in outline, if not in detail. He became consort on February 6, 1952, and threw himself into reforming the operations of Buckingham Palace from the beginning of the new reign. According to Royal.uk, Philip was significantly involved in modernizing the running of Buckingham Palace, designing a method for filing papers, introducing a dictograph internal communication system, and establishing the administrative infrastructure of the new household. These weren't decorative projects. They were a systematic reconstruction of how the palace operated, who had access to what, how information flowed, whose authority organized daily functions. His relationship with the Queen Mother involved documented tension. The sources are consistent on that much, even where they disagree on specifics. She had initially had reservations about his engagement to Elizabeth. He represented the new order in the most personal possible way. A man who had no intention of treating the palace as though it belonged to anyone's previous chapter. The heating anecdote, that Philip had the Queen Mother's heating turned off to force her out, appears in tabloid coverage attributed to unnamed sources. It hasn't surfaced in any major biography, does not appear in the Shawcross authorized account or the Vickers independent biography, and should be treated accordingly. Interesting as theater, unverifiable as history. The documented reality is sufficient without it. What can be said with confidence is that Philip stood inside the new household's authority and didn't defer to the old order. He was rebuilding the institution's internal operations from the ground up. The Queen Mother's presence in Buckingham Palace during that period, her continued use of the royal R, her long-established routines, her relationships with staff who had served her for years, would have functioned as a competing signal about who commanded the house. The precedent, meanwhile, wasn't unique to 1952. When Edward VII died in May 1910 and his son became George V, Queen Alexandra, Edward's widow, was also reluctant to vacate Buckingham Palace. Historical sources describe her as uneager to leave, and note that the transition created tension in the royal family. The new king and his wife were reportedly less than comfortable with the arrangement. Alexandra was moved along eventually to Marlborough House, but not without delay and not without difficulty. So the Queen Mother's reluctance in 1952 wasn't unprecedented. What made it different was the particular woman involved and the particular new queen on the other side of the standoff. Queen Alexandra wasn't Elizabeth Bowes Lyon. She had not spent 15 years projecting herself as the emotional anchor of British public life. She had not declared from the ruins of her bombed house that she could now look the East End in the face. She had not worn the rainbow of hope in deliberate contrast to wartime black. The Queen Mother was, by 1952, one of the most beloved public figures in Britain, a brand built carefully and genuinely over decades. Her continued presence in Buckingham Palace wasn't quiet or invisible. It carried meaning. And then there is the contradiction that runs through her entire story, the one that makes her more complicated than either the sainted grandmother of popular myth or the scheming dowager of critical biography. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon spent the early 1920s refusing to marry into the royal family. Prince Albert proposed in 1921, and she turned him down. He proposed again in March 1922, and she refused him again. She eventually accepted in January 1923, after he had reportedly declared he would marry no one else. Her own words, recorded at the time of that first refusal, explain the hesitation. She was afraid of never again being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she really ought to. She feared the loss of personal freedom. She doubted whether she was suited to the public role. She had real misgivings about what the life would cost her. She accepted. She married. She became Duchess of York, then, unexpectedly, Queen Consort when the abdication arrived. She wore the role well, exceptionally well by almost any measure. And then, in 1952, when the role formally ended, when the Constitution required her to step back, she appears to have found the stepping back considerably more difficult than the stepping in. The woman who was afraid to enter couldn't bring herself to leave. That contradiction isn't a character flaw in the simple sense. It's the shape of a person who discovered, inside a life she had not initially wanted, that she was extraordinary at it. Power agreed with her. Public life agreed with her. The household, the ceremonies, the balcony appearances, the relationship with staff who had served her loyally. All of it had become, over 15 years, the material of her identity. Taking it away wasn't returning her to freedom. It was something closer to amputation. She lived for another 50 years after George VI died. She died at Royal Lodge, Windsor, on March 30th, 2002, aged 101. She remained one of the most publicly beloved members of the royal family throughout those decades, a consistent presence at public events, the woman the crowds adored. She built a second life at Clarence House, and it was by most accounts a rich one. A residence full of art, salmon fishing trips to Scotland, the extraordinary network of friends and supporters she maintained until the end. But it began, in 1952, with a question about Buckingham Palace and what it meant that she was still inside it. The constitutional reality was clear, even if it was never stated as harshly as the situation required. No legal mechanism existed to force the Queen Mother from Buckingham Palace. The palace isn't the private property of the reigning monarch and can't be evicted in any legal sense. What existed instead was convention, the deep, powerful, habitually binding convention that Buckingham Palace is the residence and headquarters of the sovereign, and that the sovereign occupies it because the institution demands that occupancy. Whoever sits inside Buckingham Palace, with the royal standard flying above the gate, appears to hold the monarchy. That appearance isn't legally binding, But in a constitutional monarchy that runs largely on appearances and convention, it's close enough to binding that the difference doesn't much matter in practice. Elizabeth II needed Buckingham Palace for the same institutional reasons politicians and courtiers cited when they insisted she move there. It wasn't personal preference. It was where the Prime Minister came. It was where the ambassadors arrived. It was where the balcony was, and the flag, and the machinery of the state that operated in the monarch's name. A queen who ceded that ground, even temporarily, even to her mother, even in grief, was a queen whose authority existed in question. She didn't cede it. The move happened over months. The transition, whatever its exact texture, however many conversations it required, however clearly or obliquely the point was made, resolved itself. By the time of the coronation on June 2, 1953, the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were installed at Clarence House. Clarence House's own records confirm her tenancy there from 1953 until her death in 2002. The machine of Buckingham Palace reorganized around Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. The files were redesigned. The communication systems were updated. The household answered to the new queen. What had actually been tested in those months wasn't a lease or a property arrangement. It was whether the institution would align itself to the person who held the crown, or continue to operate as though the previous arrangement still obtained. The answer Elizabeth extracted, slowly, without drama, without a legal mechanism to force it, was the first answer of her reign. The monarchy answered to the queen. The building answered to the queen. The staff answered to the queen. Not to the memory of the previous reign, not to the woman who had occupied the position for 15 years and appeared, in the months after George VI's death, to find it difficult to accept that the position had ended. Hugo Vickers described the Queen Mother as someone who projected softness while operating with steel underneath. That description helps explain how the standoff unfolded. She didn't stage a dramatic refusal. She didn't announce that she was staying. She simply remained and signed her letters as she always had, and the household continued to function in the patterns she had established. It took the new queen, 25 years old, grieving, personally preferring a smaller house on the Mall, to insist, through whatever combination of direct request and institutional pressure, that the patterns change. The Elizabeth R. signature is the most documented evidence of what the Queen Mother appeared to believe about her own position. It's a small detail, and a devastating one. It wasn't a bureaucratic error. It was the signature of a woman who had spent 15 years as the only Elizabeth R. in the building, and who appears not to have fully accepted, at least in those early months, that there was now another one. Elizabeth II tolerated it in silence. Tina Brown notes that the Queen, normally exacting about such matters of protocol, said nothing about the continued use of the royal designation. There is a reading of that silence as generosity, a daughter protecting a grieving mother from the embarrassment of correction. There is another reading, which is that the silence itself was a kind of assertion. The new queen was secure enough in her authority that she didn't need to correct the paperwork. She corrected it in the only way that mattered. She moved into Buckingham Palace. She reorganized its operations. She held her weekly audiences with the Prime Minister in its rooms. The institution aligned. The question the palace standoff was really asking wasn't, "Where will Mummy live?" It was whether the transfer of the crown was complete, whether the woman who wore it was sovereign, or whether the woman who had spent 15 years as queen consort still commanded the institution through force of habit and the loyalty of a household she had shaped. The answer turned out to be yes, the transfer was complete. But it required Elizabeth to make that answer explicit. And making it explicit meant confronting a woman she loved, in the months when they were grieving the same loss, from the position of institutional authority rather than daughterly deference. It meant being queen rather than daughter, at a moment when being daughter was probably what she wanted most. The Queen Mother could keep the title. She kept it for 50 years. She could keep the public affection, and she did, more than almost anyone else in the royal family. She could keep Birk Hall at Balmoral and Royal Lodge at Windsor, and the Castle of May she bought in 1953 in the far north of Scotland, a crumbling castle she restored into something of her own. She built an extraordinary second act. What she couldn't keep was Buckingham Palace. Not because the law prevented it, because the monarchy required the Queen to hold it, and the Queen was no longer her. Buckingham Palace was never about where to put Mummy. It was about whether Mummy still believed the palace obeyed her. Elizabeth II's first act of sovereignty wasn't a speech, not a ceremony, not a foreign policy position. It was proving, to the woman who raised her, inside the building they both knew, that the monarchy had changed hands, that the palace answered to the Queen now, and only to the Queen. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe. There's more like it.